Jean-Jacques Rousseau stands as one of the most profound thinkers of the Enlightenment, a man whose life and writings have indelibly shaped the trajectory of Western civilization. Born in Geneva in 1712, Rousseau's existence was a perpetual negotiation between the allure of unspoiled nature and the complexities of a rapidly modernizing society. His journey traversed humble beginnings, intellectual awakenings, passionate relationships, and fierce encounters with the ideological giants of his era. In each chapter of his life, Rousseau struggled with questions that would become defining themes in philosophy: politics and pedagogy, the inherent goodness of man, the corrupting influence of society, the pursuit of freedom, and the reclamation of authentic expression. Before we dive in, make sure to subscribe and hit that like button to support the channel. And don't forget to turn on the notification bell so you never miss an audiobook that could change your life. Now let's begin. Enjoy. Chapter 1. The Child of Geneva. Early Life and Struggles. The story of Jean-Jacques Rousseau begins amidst the cobblestone paths and serene vistas of Geneva, a city renowned for its lakeshore beauty and civic independence. Born on June 28, 1712, Rousseau entered the world in modest circumstances, the second son of Isaac Rousseau, a skilled watchmaker, and Suzanne Bernard Rousseau, whose fragile health would cast an early shadow over the family. Rousseau's earliest years were marked by loss and upheaval. His mother died tragically just days after his birth, an absence that would instill in the young Rousseau a lifelong sense of longing and grief. Isaac Rousseau raised his son with affection and guidance, instilling in him a deep respect for literature and an insatiable curiosity. Together, they would spend evenings poring over the classics, Plutarch, Livy, and the tales of ancient heroes whose virtues and sufferings would leave indelible impressions on Rousseau's spirit. Yet the narrow security of childhood was soon eroded by familial discord and external pressures. Geneva, though proud and independent, was a city divided by religious and social tensions, its Calvinist roots imposing rigorous discipline and moral restraint on its citizens. The Rousseau household was not immune to misfortune. When Jean-Jacques was just 10, his father was compelled to leave Geneva after a quarrel with a local official, an event that would fracture the family and force the child into the guardianship of his uncle and later other relatives. The instability of Rousseau's early years, a cycle of abandonment, relocation, and yearning for guidance, sowed within him a tender vulnerability, a need for belonging that he would pursue relentlessly throughout his life. Rousseau's education in Geneva was uneven, interrupted by the constraints of poverty and frequent moves. Yet it was on these unsteady foundations that his intellect and imagination took root. The city itself, situated between lake and mountain, offered young Rousseau moments of solace and communion with the natural world. He would wander the countryside, discovering solace among the trees, streams, and wildflowers, fostering a lifelong passion for the harmonies and mysteries of nature. These solitary explorations were acts not merely of escape, but of self-education, as Rousseau cultivated habits of reflection that would later inform his philosophical inquiries. The Calvinist rigor of Geneva, with its emphasis on discipline, frugality, and hierarchy, was both a constraint and a crucible for Rousseau. While it imparted values of civic virtue and moral sincerity, it also impressed upon him the suffocating effects of an overly regulated society. These early encounters with authority and exclusion sharpened his sensitivity to themes of freedom, authenticity, and alienation, motifs that would recur in his writings with increasing urgency. Rousseau's adolescent years were a phase of increasing estrangement from his native city. His sensitivity and pride, combined with a series of unhappy apprenticeships, most notably to an engraver whose cruelty drove Rousseau to despair, forced him to seek new horizons beyond Geneva's forbidding walls. Thus began the cycle of wandering and searching, the restless spirit that defined so much of his later life. The seeds of Rousseau's philosophy can be discerned in this period of deprivation and yearning. The wounds of childhood, loss, loneliness, the search for love, were not merely private sorrows, but the genesis of a profound meditation on the human condition. As he matured, Rousseau would transform pain into insight, drawing upon the memories of Geneva's constraining social order and his nascent love of nature to challenge the forces he believed corrupted mankind. The child of Geneva, shaped by adversity, emerged into adolescence, carrying within him the questions that would animate the Enlightenment. How does culture shape character? What is our natural state, and what have we lost in the march toward civilization? Rousseau's early life and struggles were more than the prelude to genius. They were the crucible in which the philosopher's spirit was forged, setting him on a lifelong quest to reconcile the yearnings of the heart with the demands of society. Chapter 2, A Wandering Youth Escaping the City. Searching for Purpose. Jean-Jacques Rousseau's transition from adolescence to young adulthood was marked by a pronounced restlessness, a search for meaning that propelled him beyond Geneva's boundaries into the wider world. The departure from his native city was both physical and symbolic, an escape from the rigid conventions and stifling authority that had defined his early years. Driven by a mixture of rebellion, aspiration, and vulnerability, Rousseau embraced a life of wandering that would become a defining motif in his personal and intellectual development. At 16, Rousseau abandoned his apprenticeship as an engraver, a profession for which he had little aptitude and even less affection. His mentor's harshness and the monotony of trade embittered him, illuminating for Rousseau the tension between imposed duty and authentic inclination. In 1728, seizing an opportunity for liberation, Rousseau slipped away from Geneva, crossing into Savoy with little more than his meager belongings and a heart hungry for adventure. Rousseau's initial years on the road were marked by uncertainty and hardship. He found temporary refuge among acquaintances and strangers, eking out a living through odd jobs and small acts of charity. The world beyond Geneva offered not only new landscapes, but also unfamiliar dangers, poverty, exposure, and the constant threat of rejection. Yet these difficulties forced Rousseau into a state of heightened self-reliance and reflection, encouraging the development of the introspective style that would later characterize his autobiographical works. It was in Annecy that Rousseau encountered Madame de Warens, a pivotal figure whose influence on Rousseau cannot be overstated. Marie-Thérèse Louise de Warens was a woman of remarkable charm and intellect, a convert to Catholicism who took Rousseau under her wing with genuine maternal concern. Rousseau's conversion to Catholicism, though motivated partly by necessity, would become a source of both liberation and internal strife, challenging his identity and worldview. Madame de Warens offered Rousseau lodging, education, and companionship, gradually fostering both his emotional openness and intellectual growth. Under Madame de Warens' guidance, Rousseau was introduced to music, literature, and the arts, subjects that would shape his aesthetic sensibilities and future creative endeavors. Yet his position was precarious, a blend of student, servant, dependent, and eventually lover. Rousseau's feelings for Madame de Warens were deeply complex, woven with gratitude, admiration, and a persistent sense of inadequacy. Their relationship would span years, marked by periods of affection and estrangement, stability and upheaval. The itinerant life also exposed Rousseau to the broader world of Enlightenment Europe, its social hierarchies, philosophical debates, and religious tensions. He traveled through Turin, Lyon, and other cities, absorbing new ideas even as he struggled to find his footing. Rousseau's voracious reading, spanning everything from classical literature to contemporary philosophy, provided solace and direction amid the turbulence, sowing the seeds for the intellectual awakening that would soon transform him. Rousseau's search for purpose was deeply intertwined with his experience of displacement and dependence. The rootlessness of his youth, The absence of a fixed home, stable income, or social status imbued him with an acute sensitivity to the conditions that shaped human identity and dignity. Rousseau saw firsthand how society could both nurture and marginalize, inspire and oppress. These lessons would form the foundational paradoxes of his later writings. Moreover, Rousseau's time with Madame de Warren offered a glimpse of love and acceptance, even as the relationship revealed the limits of dependence and patronage. Rousseau's oscillation between gratitude and frustration, fulfillment and loss, led to profound meditations on autonomy, authenticity, and the formation of the self. The question that haunted him: what does it mean to live freely? To act according to one's nature was no longer merely abstract, but the core of his personal experience. In sum, Rousseau's wandering youth marked the critical passage from innocence to experience, from subjugation to self-discovery. His journey was fraught with insecurity and contradiction, yet it was precisely through these ordeals that Rousseau forged his singular perspective, a belief in the possibility of renewal, the value of authentic feeling, and the imperative of returning to a more natural state of existence. The escape from the city thus became not merely a geographic transition, but a deep philosophical quest, a search for purpose that would soon flower into one of the most original and provocative intellectual careers of the Enlightenment. Chapter 3: The Awakening of a Philosopher, Encountering Enlightenment Ideas. The emergence of Jean-Jacques Rousseau as a philosopher was neither accidental nor sudden. Rather, it was the gradual result of his lived experiences and the intellectual currents that swept across 18th century Europe. Amidst the diversity of his wanderings and personal tribulations, Rousseau's encounter with the ideas of the Enlightenment marked a decisive turning point, propelling him from the realm of personal struggle into the sphere of public debate and philosophical innovation. The Enlightenment, an intellectual movement that championed reason, empiricism, and human progress, held sway over the salons and universities of Europe. Its greatest proponents, Voltaire, Diderot, Montesquieu, and others, advocated for the power of reason to reform society, liberate the mind, and cultivate happiness. Rousseau, with his unique sensitivity and unconventional background, approached these prevailing doctrines with both admiration and skepticism. Rousseau's earliest philosophical inquiries were ignited not only by the texts he devoured, Plutarch, Cicero, Locke, but by the example of intellectual discourse he witnessed firsthand. The salons of Annecy and later Paris provided Rousseau with exposure to spirited debates, challenging his assumptions and refining his argumentative skills. Yet Rousseau was never fully at home in these milieus. His social insecurity and uncompromising temperament often set him at odds with the more urbane philosophes. Central to Rousseau's philosophical awakening was his confrontation with the optimism of the Enlightenment. While the prevailing wisdom held that civilization and rationality were vectors of progress, Rousseau discerned within contemporary society evidence of alienation, inequality, and loss of authenticity. He began to question the belief that social advancement inevitably produced moral improvement, suggesting instead that the sophistication of the arts and sciences might serve to obscure rather than reveal fundamental truths about human nature. It was during this period that Rousseau articulated his initial reflections on the concept of natural goodness. Drawing from his own experiences of loss, solitude, and intimate communion with nature, Rousseau proposed that mankind possessed an innate disposition toward kindness and empathy, a disposition increasingly stifled by social convention and hierarchical constraint. Rousseau's vision of human nature was at once radical and restorative, seeking to reclaim a sense of primordial innocence against the corrupting influence of modernity. Rousseau's relationship with the Enlightenment was thus dynamic and contentious. He absorbed its intellectual methods, critical reasoning, skepticism, dialectics, even as he resisted its assumptions about progress and civilization. His emergence as a philosopher was characterized by daring originality and deep emotional engagement, qualities that distinguished him from his contemporaries and rendered his ideas both provocative and enduring. The transformation from wandering dependent to independent thinker was facilitated by a growing circle of acquaintances and patrons who recognized Rousseau's talent. Though he struggled with perpetual poverty and the vagaries of social status, Rousseau's output began to attract attention. His essays, letters, and treatises reflected an intense commitment to clarity and honesty, qualities that often put him at odds with the more pragmatic or diplomatic thinkers of his age. Of particular significance was Rousseau's participation in the prize essay competitions sponsored by academic societies in France. In 1750, Rousseau submitted his renowned discourse on the arts and sciences to a contest organized by the Academy of Dijon, a work that captivated attention and catapulted him into the limelight. Rousseau's thesis that the development of civilization led not to the elevation, but to the moral degradation of humanity, was a direct challenge to Enlightenment optimism. The awakening of Rousseau as a philosopher was therefore marked by a sustained engagement with the problems of society, nature, and the self. He was not content to accept the dogmas or assumptions of his age. Instead, he sought to interrogate and ultimately transform them. Rousseau's intellectual journey was animated by a relentless search for truth, a refusal to compromise his ideals, and an abiding commitment to the dignity of the individual. The seeds sown in his early education, his wanderings, and his exposure to Enlightenment thought would soon bear fruit in the form of groundbreaking writings that would forever alter the landscape of Western philosophy. Chapter 4. Love and Learning. Madame de Warens and Rousseau's transformation. The relationship between Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Madame de Warens was pivotal, an intersection of personal and intellectual awakening that profoundly shaped the course of his life. Marie-Thérèse Louise de Warens, a charismatic and benevolent figure nearly 13 years Rousseau's senior, entered his life during a moment of vulnerability and transition. As a benefactress and lover, she became the center of Rousseau's emotional universe, nurturing him in ways that would echo throughout his philosophical and literary endeavors. Rousseau's first encounter with Madame de Warens occurred in Annecy, where, as a displaced youth in search of shelter and guidance, he found in her a rare combination of maternal affection and intellectual companionship. Madame de Warens, herself a product of religious and ideological upheaval, having converted to Catholicism and forfeited her inheritance, embodied both independence of spirit and generosity of heart. She welcomed Rousseau into her home, offering him not only material support, but an environment in which curiosity and expression were encouraged. Under Madame de Warens' tutelage, Rousseau experienced a kind of rebirth. She introduced him to music, instilling in him an appreciation for harmony, composition, and emotional nuance. Rousseau's subsequent career as a music theorist and composer, though overshadowed by his philosophical writings, owed much to this formative period of instruction. Together, Rousseau and Madame de Warens explored literature, philosophy, and natural sciences, forming a partnership grounded in mutual respect and intellectual stimulation. Their relationship was not free from complexity. Initially cast in the role of protégé and dependent, Rousseau gradually became Madame de Warens' lover, and the transition from filial to romantic affection was fraught with both joy and confusion. Rousseau's feelings for her oscillated between reverence, passion, and a persistent anxiety over inadequacy. He often described her as his maman, a term laden with emotional ambiguity, signaling both gratitude for her protection and a longing for maternal care. This phase of Rousseau's life, spanning more than a decade, was marked by dramatically shifting fortunes. He participated in the management of Madame de Warens' household, assisted with her business affairs, and came to inhabit a world shaped by leisure and intellectual pursuit. Yet Rousseau's position was always precarious, subject to the changing moods and circumstances of his benefactress, as well as the economic instability that frequently afflicted their household. Despite these tensions, Rousseau's years with Madame de Warens were among the happiest and most productive of his life. In her presence, he gained confidence and conviction, acquiring knowledge and aesthetic sensibility that would inform his subsequent writing. The intimacy and tumult of their relationship fueled Rousseau's introspective style, and his later confessions would reflect the deep, psychological imprint she left upon him, the lessons of love and learning from. Madame de Warens were inseparable from Rousseau's broader philosophical transformation. He came to see the possibility of authentic self-expression, the opening up of feeling as a source of wisdom and creativity. Rousseau's skepticism toward conventional education and his advocacy for natural, individualized learning derived in large part from this experience. He rejected the rote methods and coercive discipline characteristic of his own early schooling, advocating instead for an approach that fostered curiosity, independence, and emotional growth. Madame de Warens also helped Rousseau cultivate a sense of belonging, mitigating the loneliness and alienation that had plagued his youth. Yet her patronage could not resolve the essential tensions within Rousseau's character. His need for autonomy battled constantly with his dependence on her affection and support. This ongoing dialectic between gratitude and frustration, fulfillment and loss, shaped Rousseau's understanding of human relationships and the development of the self. As the years passed, the relationship between Rousseau and Madame de Warens gradually faded, subject to the pressures of financial difficulty, diverging interests, and the intrusion of other lovers and dependents. Rousseau's eventual departure was bittersweet, a necessary step in his journey toward independence, but also the end of an epoch marked by intimacy, learning, and self-discovery. In the crucible of his relationship with Madame de Warens, Rousseau was transformed. He forged not only a new sense of self, but also a philosophy rooted in the conviction that love, freedom, and learning could flourish only in conditions of authenticity and mutual respect. These themes would resurface in Rousseau's educational treatises, his literary confessions, and his political theories, echoes of a formative period in which life, feeling and thought converged in the pursuit of truth. Chapter 5. Paris and the Philosophe, Entering the World of Ideas. Jean-Jacques. Rousseau's odyssey into the world of ideas began in the vibrant heart of 18th century Paris. The city was a crucible of intellectual ferment, the epicenter where Enlightenment thought coalesced into debates that would shape the future of Europe. Among the bustling boulevards and glittering salons, Rousseau entered a circle of thinkers who, under the banner of reason, sought to reimagine the contours of human society. Paris, at this time, was more than a metropolis. It was a stage on which the grand drama of intellectual transformation played out. Rousseau arrived in the city as an outsider, both culturally and socially, but with a keen sensitivity to the evolving currents of philosophical discourse. His encounter with the philosophers, Voltaire, Diderot, d'Alembert, and others, was pivotal. These men, shapers of the encyclopédie and proponents of reason, welcomed Rousseau into their fold, impressed by the acuity of his mind and the originality of his perspectives. The salons were arenas for rigorous debate. Rousseau, though naturally reserved, quickly distinguished himself by the fervor and depth of his inquiry. He listened as ideas were exchanged with dazzling wit. The nature of progress, the authority of institutions, the role of art and science in human advancement. In these circles, Rousseau's sensitivity to the dissonance between surface sophistication and underlying corruption began to sharpen. Initially, Rousseau was seduced by the Enlightenment's promise. He believed in the potential of rational discourse to foster human liberty and progress. However, the more he observed the machinations of court society and the subtle hierarchies among the philosophers, the more he grew wary of their optimism. Was the cultivation of intellect truly leading mankind towards freedom and happiness, or merely furnishing new tools for domination and exclusion? His immersion in Parisian society exposed Rousseau to the social disparities masked by cultural refinement. Behind the glittering facade, he noticed the patronage, the rivalry for access to power, and the marginalization of those outside the elite circle. Rousseau's growing discomfort led him to question the assumptions that undergirded Enlightenment thought. Where others saw progress, Rousseau saw artifice, a veiling of authentic human experience behind the trappings of civilization. This tension manifested in Rousseau's contributions to philosophical debates. His skepticism of society's claims for improvement resonated with some, while alienating others. He challenged the utility of polished manners and the moralizing role of the state, suggesting instead that refinement tended to corrupt inherent human goodness. For Rousseau, the path to knowledge required not only intellectual acumen but also a commitment to integrity and the courage to confront uncomfortable truths. Rousseau's breakthrough would arrive with his celebrated response to the Académie de Dijon's question on whether the advancement of arts and sciences had contributed to the improvement of morals, a response that would revolutionize the landscape of European thought. But even before this moment, his presence in Paris marked the emergence of a voice attuned to the contradictions within the Enlightenment project. In this crucible of ideas, Rousseau also forged important personal relationships. He befriended Denis Diderot, whose radical thinking would shape the Encyclopédie, and formed associations with Madame de Warren, whose patronage and emotional support would later prove crucial. Rousseau's social position was always tenuous, never fully accepted by the aristocratic elite, and often viewed with suspicion or envy by his peers. Thus, Paris became the setting for Rousseau's philosophical coming-of-age. It was here that he refined his principles amid lively debate and personal challenge. The city's intellectual climate forced him to confront the paradoxes of modernity, that the swelling tide of knowledge and sophistication often coincided with a deepening of social divisions and moral uncertainty. In retrospect, Rousseau's entry into the world of ideas brought forth the seeds of his greatest works. Paris was a city that dazzled, but also provoked, a place where Rousseau's genius for inquiry found fertile ground, and where his doubts began to crystallize into an enduring critique of society. His initial enthusiasm would soon be tempered by the realization that civilization's promises of enlightenment would often come at the expense of authenticity and simplicity. The chapter closes with Rousseau poised on the verge of his most famous intellectual rebellion. The world of Paris had both welcomed and estranged him, furnishing the stage on which his philosophy would confront the dominant ideologies of his era. Rousseau emerged not merely as an observer of ideas, but as one who dared to question their very foundations, setting the course for a life spent exploring and resisting the dance between nature and civilization. Chapter 6. The Discourse on the Arts and Sciences, the Birth of a Rebel Thinker. The year 1750 heralded a turning point in the intellectual life of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Spurred by the provocative question posed by the Académie de Dijon, has the restoration of the sciences and arts contributed to the purification of morals? Rousseau entered a public contest that would catapult him to both fame and notoriety. His response, the Discours sur les sciences et les arts, Discourse on the Sciences and Arts, was incendiary, challenging the assumption that progress in knowledge inevitably leads to moral enlightenment. For Rousseau, the prevailing optimism of his Enlightenment peers masked a profound disquiet. Where others celebrated the flourishing of literature, philosophy, and the sciences, Rousseau detected signs of decay. He argued that while society's intellectual achievements had delivered unprecedented sophistication, they had also fostered vanity, envy, and deceit. The arts, he claimed, had become instruments of social stratification, their refinement serving to separate the privileged from the oppressed. The discourse, therefore, exposed a fundamental tension, the contradiction between cultural progress and authentic virtue. Rousseau's central thesis was that far from elevating mankind, the growth of knowledge had distanced humanity from its natural state, a state marked by innocence, sincerity, and equitable relations. Civilization, with its intricate social codes and relentless pursuit of comparison, had bred rivalry and servility, eroding the simple origins of human dignity. Rousseau's critique struck at the heart of Enlightenment values. He cited examples from ancient societies, emphasizing that Roman virtue and Spartan simplicity gave way to decadence as their cultures became more sophisticated. He lamented how the cultivation of wit, style, and taste had come to replace substance and honor, reducing relationships to performances governed by convention rather than genuine sentiment. This polemic was not merely theoretical. Rousseau saw the corruption firsthand in his own Parisian milieu. He had observed how the salons, ostensibly dedicated to intellectual exchange, were arenas for social maneuvering and status-seeking. The arts and sciences, instead of liberating minds, had often become tools for exclusion and manipulation. The discourse resonated profoundly, inciting heated debate throughout Europe. Some contemporaries hailed Rousseau's moral courage and originality. Others accused him of reactionary nostalgia, or worse, of undermining the intellectual foundations of modern society. Yet Rousseau's daring was unmistakable. He had called into question the very project that animated so many of his peers. Rousseau himself was transformed by the experience. The applause and controversy that followed the publication of his discourse gave birth to the rebel thinker, one increasingly willing to contend with orthodoxy and to defend unpopular truths. His isolation from the philosophe deepened, and the strain of public scrutiny would later contribute to his sense of alienation and vulnerability. Yet, the discourse on the sciences and arts signaled more than Rousseau's break with the Enlightenment mainstream. It initiated a broader philosophical revolution, the idea that the quest for natural goodness must confront, if not oppose, the refinements of civilization. Rousseau's insistence that happiness resides not in social advancement but in the preservation of honesty and simplicity would echo through subsequent generations. This bold intervention also introduced themes that would define Rousseau's later work: the tension between artifice and authenticity, the dangers of comparison and competition, the alienation produced by modernity, all would resurface in his future writings. Rousseau's discourse pointed to an ideal rooted in nature, the recovery of selfhood through the rejection of unnecessary sophistication. Rousseau's discourse did not propose a wholesale rejection of cultural progress. Instead, it called for vigilance, a critical awareness of how civilization's gifts can distort rather than elevate. He cautioned against the belief that knowledge alone suffices for moral purity. True virtue, he argued, requires an engagement with the core of human nature, unmediated by the distractions of art and science. As the controversy subsided, Rousseau stood at a crossroads. He had entered the world of ideas by challenging its most cherished assumptions, carving out a space for dissent amidst consensus. His originality lay not only in his skepticism, but in his conviction that inquiry must address the deepest needs of the human. The birth of Rousseau as a rebel thinker was thus both a personal and intellectual awakening. He would spend the remainder of his life and the remainder of his work wrestling with the implications of his stance. In so doing, Rousseau prepared the way for a philosophy that would interrogate the roots of inequality, envision the possibility of collective freedom, and offer new models for education and social organization. Rousseau's challenge in the discourse remains relevant, even urgent today. In an era similarly obsessed with progress and innovation, his warning reverberates: unless tempered by a commitment to virtue, Cultural achievement risks becoming a mask for deeper forms of alienation and injustice. The rebel thinker, in his solitary stance, continues to remind us that the good society must begin at the foundations of human character and solidarity. Chapter 7. Civilization and Corruption, the Roots of Inequality. Rousseau's early insights into the corruptions of civilization found their fullest expression in his next landmark work, The Discours sur l'origine et les fondements de l'inégalité parmi les hommes, Discourse on the Origin and Foundations of Inequality Among Men. Here, Rousseau undertook an ambitious project, tracing the historical and philosophical origins of social disparity and moral decline. Rousseau's analysis began with a hypothetical reconstruction of human nature as it existed prior to the development of organized society. Man is born free, he famously argued, and yet everywhere he finds himself entangled in the chains of convention, wealth, and hierarchy. Rousseau's narrative was not merely an elegy for a lost innocence, but a philosophical investigation into the mechanisms by which civilization generates and perpetuates inequality. For Rousseau, the first step away from original equality was the establishment of private property. He imagines the origins thus: the first man who, having enclosed a piece of land, thought to say, "This is mine," and found people simple enough to believe him, was the true founder of civil society. With property came the division of labor, the emergence of classes, and the codification of rank. Rousseau's critique was pointed yet nuanced. He did not suggest that the natural state, a condition of primitive simplicity, was free from hardship or conflict. Rather, he maintained that in this state, inequalities were minimal and largely confined to differences of age, health, or strength. Social disparity, in contrast, stemmed from the artificial structures of civilization. These structures fostered ambition, greed, and rivalry, leading to the systematic oppression of the many by the few. As societies developed, Rousseau argued, institutions arose to protect the advantages of property holders, legitimizing exploitation under the guise of law and order. Governments and states, he contended, were often tools of the rich, established to perpetuate inequality rather than mitigate it. The arts, sciences, and religious authorities combined to sanctify the status quo, further distancing humanity from its natural state. Rousseau's critique of civilization was not a wholesale condemnation of collective life. Rather, it was a call to recognize the ways in which culture, law, and custom can become instruments of domination. He was acutely aware that human sociability must be balanced with safeguards against corruption, and that true happiness was unlikely within a society premised on exclusion and hierarchy. The Discourse on Inequality also introduced Rousseau's concept of amour propre, a form of self-love that arises from comparison with others and from the desire for recognition and esteem. In societies structured by competition, amour propre replaces amour de soi, the simpler self-regard characteristic of life in nature. This transformation, Rousseau warned, leads to perpetual discontent and a collapse of genuine community. Rousseau's analysis was prescient. His recognition that social structures depend on shared illusions, constructed through language, law, and myth, anticipated later philosophical inquiries into ideology and hegemony. Rousseau understood that inequality is less the product of natural differences than of collective decisions and institutional arrangements. The starkness of Rousseau's critique did not make him a nihilist. Rather, he sought alternatives, new foundations for social life that might recover the lost promise of equality. The discourse led naturally to his later reflections in The Social Contract, where Rousseau would attempt to articulate principles for a just and free society. For contemporaries, Rousseau's discourse on inequality was provocative and unsettling. It challenged the complacency of elites and questioned the legitimacy of institutions that seemed immovable. Its historical reconstruction was imaginative but pointed, offering a narrative of civilization that foregrounded loss as much as progress. Rousseau asked his readers not simply to accept the world as given, but to interrogate the origins of its divisions and injustices. His vision remains compelling. In Rousseau's account, civilization is a double-edged sword, capable of refinement and grandeur, but also marked by the shadows of exploitation and exclusion. The roots of inequality, he insisted, run deep, not simply in economic arrangements, but in the psychic and social structures that shape modern life. Rousseau positioned himself as both diagnostician and prophet. He exposed the vulnerabilities of a culture enthralled by its own achievements, urging his readers to seek remedies not in further sophistication, but in the restoration of genuine equality and solidarity. Through this lens, Rousseau's philosophy becomes a call to renewal, a reminder that civilization, to be worthy of its name, must be grounded in justice rather than power, and in community rather than competition. Chapter 8. The Noble Savage. Man in the State of Nature. At the heart of Rousseau's critique of civilization stands his evocative vision of the noble savage. While Rousseau never employed the phrase directly in his works, the concept aptly captures his reconstruction of humans in the state of nature, before the advent of property, law, and social constraints. The noble savage embodies Rousseau's conviction that genuine goodness and freedom are found, not in the refinements of society, but in the simplicity of primordial existence. Rousseau's depiction of the state of nature derives from both imagination and philosophical analysis. He envisions pre-civilized humans living solitary, self-sufficient lives. They are guided by instinct and immediate needs, possessing amour de soi, a basic self-preservation that is neither competitive nor malicious. In this condition, Rousseau maintains people are inclined to compassion, sharing an innate pitié for the suffering of others. This natural compassion stands in contrast to the developed emotions and ambitions of civilized life. In the state of nature, there are no artificial inequalities. Strength, intelligence, and health vary, but there are no entrenched social hierarchies. Rousseau describes a world in which individuals encounter one another infrequently, with interactions grounded in mutual recognition and a minimal sense of rivalry. The noble savage, in Rousseau's account, is neither brutish nor angelic. Rather, he is unencumbered. He exists without the anxieties and pretensions bred by civilization. Rousseau insists that, left to their own devices, humans would not seek to dominate or exploit, and would be content with the basics of existence. Human development in this sense is not linear. Progress can coexist with the loss of fundamental virtues. This thesis was radical. It defied centuries of Western philosophy that associated pre-civilized humans with violence, chaos, and ignorance. Rousseau's portrayal opened the possibility that civilization, far from remedying human inadequacy, might actually mask or worsen it. Through comparison with the noble savage, Rousseau indicted the pride and competitiveness that pervade modern society. Rousseau's idealization of the state of nature nevertheless contains ambiguities. He acknowledges that natural life is precarious and solitary, lacking the arts and comforts of civilization. Yet he argues that the absence of luxury is compensated by the absence of social ills, greed, envy, slander, and systemic oppression. The noble savage's happiness is unreflective but real, anchored in direct experience and self-reliance. Rousseau's figure of the noble savage influenced generations of thinkers and artists. It became a symbol for critiques of colonialism, industrialization, and modern alienation. Yet Rousseau was not advocating a return to the forests and caves. Rather, his concept is a philosophical tool, a foil against which the achievements and shortcomings of contemporary society might be measured. The moral carried by Rousseau's noble savage is clear. All that is good in humanity exists before and despite the trappings of modern civilization. The contamination of virtue occurs when desire and ambition, fostered by social organization and competition, supplant the innocence of natural self-love. In the civilized world, amour propre replaces amour de soi, and humans become prisoners not of nature's scarcity, but of society's excess. Rousseau's ideas provoked intense debate. Critics accused him of naive romanticism and of ignoring the real dangers and sufferings of pre-civilized life. Yet the power of the noble savage lies not in its literal accuracy, but in its challenge to prevailing models. It suggests that claims to progress should always be scrutinized with an eye to what has been lost. The figure of the noble savage offers a point of departure for Rousseau's broader philosophical project. It sharpens the contrast between natural innocence and artificial corruption, and lays the groundwork for his subsequent explorations of the social contract, education, and political community. In all, the noble savage serves as a reminder that the essential task of philosophy is not only to understand the world as it is, but to reimagine how it might be. Rousseau, through his revaluation of nature, impels us to look past the surface of civilization, to discern how structures and norms can obscure rather than enhance the human spirit. The noble savage remains an emblem, not of a lost paradise, but of the permanent possibility of goodness, simplicity, and mutual recognition in an age otherwise captivated by progress and sophistication. Chapter 9, General Will and Collective Freedom. In the annals of political philosophy, few concepts have generated as much intrigue and controversy as Jean-Jacques Rousseau's general will, born of Rousseau's profound discontent with hierarchical society and the atomizing tendencies of Enlightenment liberalism. The general will is not simply a legislative principle, but an ethical linchpin in Rousseau's vision of collective freedom. Rousseau presents the general will most famously in his treatises. The Social Contract and Discourse on the Origin and Foundations of Inequality Among Men. For Rousseau, the act of forging a society is not a mere utilitarian agreement among individuals, each pursuing their own interests, a conception he attributes to Hobbes and Locke, but a moral association wherein each citizen subsumes personal interests beneath a collective identity. The general will, Rousseau writes, is always right, not because it is infallible, but because it represents the sum of individual aspirations, refined through deliberation toward the common good. This concept invites several layers of interpretation, each deepening our understanding of collective freedom. Rousseau's vision is rooted in the idea that liberty is not merely the absence of constraint, but the capacity to participate meaningfully in laws one has a hand in crafting. The citizen under Rousseau's social contract is forced to be free, a provocative assertion explaining that genuine autonomy arises only when individual appetites are moderated by a higher allegiance to society as a whole. Rousseau laments that in most societies, laws are tools of the powerful serving sectional interests. The general will, by contrast, aims at impartiality. Laws reflect the shared welfare rather than the commands of a sovereign. Central to Rousseau's argument is a robust concept of equality. He recognizes that natural inequalities, differences in strength, intelligence, resources, can undermine the authenticity of collective decision-making. Thus, for the general will to emerge, political institutions must foster civic virtue and protect citizens from domination. Rousseau's ideal polity is small, participatory, and deeply democratic. Every member must deliberate freely without manipulation for the general will to crystallize. Critics, especially in later centuries, have pointed out dangers in Rousseau's theory. If the general will claims moral authority, what is to prevent tyranny exercised in its name? Rousseau acknowledges this peril, distinguishing between the will of all, a mere aggregation of interests, and the general will, which only arises when citizens transcend selfishness in favor of public-mindedness. Yet the line between public interest and majority opinion is fragile. Rousseau's idealistic faith in civic education and shared purpose is as much an ethical prescription as it is a practical plan. For Rousseau, the emergence of the general will is inseparable from transformative education and the cultivation of moral sentiment. He proposes that only in a society where citizens are deeply invested in each other's welfare can the general will function as a guide to justice. Rousseau's Geneva and later his vision for Poland were iconic models, emphasizing the role of festivals, public debate, and moral instruction in forging unity. Ultimately, Rousseau's concept of collective freedom pivots on a delicate balance. It's a call to transcend the isolating atomism of modern life and rediscover the dignity of shared purpose. In a world racked by inequality, Rousseau's vision remains provocative. The true measure of liberty is not how much one is left alone, but how much one can participate in shaping the laws that govern all. Chapter 10. Sophie and the Question of Women in Rousseau's Philosophy. In Émile, Rousseau introduces Sophie not only as Émile's future companion, but also as the archetypal woman in his philosophical universe. The portrait of Sophie, gentle, modest, nurturing, provides a lens through which to examine Rousseau's convictions about sex, gender, and the role of women in society. Rousseau's treatment of Sophie has provoked extensive debate, challenging us to consider whether his philosophy liberates or confines the feminine within narrow boundaries. Rousseau's discourse on women is shaped by his belief in the natural division of roles. Men and women, for Rousseau, are endowed with distinct qualities. Men are rational and active. Women are sensitive and passive. He contends that these differences are rooted in biology, not simply cultural convention. Thus, education must reflect these natural destinies. For Sophie, the end is not independent citizenship, but the cultivation of domestic virtue, beauty, and support for her future husband. The education of Sophie, detailed in Book 5 of Émile, is more restrictive than Émile's. Rousseau prescribes for her a curriculum centered on household arts, moral instruction, and emotional restraint. While he acknowledges the intelligence and influence of women, he insists they must employ their talents within the limits of propriety, reinforcing social harmony through gentle persuasion rather than overt participation. Sophie is taught to be pliant, patient, and subservient, her worth measured by her contribution to the welfare of her family and the happiness of her husband. This philosophy has generated sharp critique from feminist scholars. Mary Wollstonecraft, among the earliest, castigated Rousseau's reduction of female autonomy. She argued that such doctrines stifle development and perpetuate dependence. Modern readings often view Rousseau's gender ideology as both a product and a reinforcement of patriarchal Enlightenment culture. His sentimentalization of the feminine, while sincere, risks confining women to ornamental or secondary roles. Yet it is essential to situate Rousseau's ideas within their historical context. His recognition of female virtue, sensitivity, and influence was not radical, but his insistence on the moral power of women reflected a nuanced appreciation for the shaping of character and the governance of the home. He believed women, through their emotional intelligence and capacity for nurturing, served as the keystone of family stability, an institution he saw as vital to social order. Rousseau's personal life offers further illumination. His relationship with Thérèse Levasseur, his partner and the mother of his children, was unconventional for the time. Rousseau's letters reveal admiration, dependence, and complexity, suggesting that his philosophical prescriptions did not wholly align with his lived experience. The contradictions between personal sentiment and theoretical position sharpen our understanding of Rousseau's worldview. Indeed, Rousseau's concern for the moral development of all men and women informs his broader political philosophy. He posits that social renewal depends on the formation of virtuous citizens, and he sees the family as both a model and a microcosm of civic association. While he excluded women from active citizenship, he recognized their power to shape the social fabric indirectly. The legacy of Rousseau's philosophy of women remains contentious. On one hand, his work perpetuated restrictive stereotypes and denied women political agency. On the other hand, it acknowledged forms of influence and emotional intelligence that would later emerge as sites of feminist critique and renewal. Rousseau's vision prompts us to ask not only how societies construct gender, but also how they might transcend these constructions toward an education that honors capacity and participation beyond the limits of nature. In sum, Sophie stands as a symbol of both the promise and the peril embedded in Rousseau's vision. Her story urges us to think critically about the relationship between philosophy, gender, and the aspirations of equality. In revisiting Rousseau's portrait, we confront the challenge of integrating the lessons of history with an ever-evolving understanding of justice and identity. Chapter 11, Religion, Morality, and the Natural Heart. Rousseau's reflections on religion and morality are inseparable from his enduring commitment to the natural heart. Though often dismissed as a radical secularist, Rousseau devoted substantial thought to the spiritual dimensions of human life, engaging in a profound critique and reimagination of religious tradition. In his Profession of Faith of the Savoyard Vicar, found within Emile, Rousseau stages a philosophical dialogue that addresses the foundations of belief, virtue, and the possibility of spiritual sincerity. Rejecting the dogmatism of institutional religion, Rousseau asserts that true piety springs not from ritual or hierarchy, but from an inner sense, a natural religion grounded in conscience and feeling. Rousseau's God is not the punitive overseer of traditional Christianity, nor the deistic abstraction of Voltaire. Instead, Rousseau envisions divinity as immanent within nature, benevolent and accessible through reasoned reflection and honest emotion. He maintains that moral law is inscribed not in scripture, but in the heart. Conscience is the voice of the soul. The passions are its voice. Both are natural, both must be governed. For Rousseau, morality is neither arbitrary nor purely rational. It is the cultivation of natural sentiment, harmonized through experience and reason. This stance set Rousseau at odds with both the Catholic hierarchy and the skeptical encyclopedists. He accused organized religion of sowing division and hypocrisy, perpetuating forms of authority that separate mankind from the true sources of virtue. Likewise, he found the dry rationalism of his contemporaries insufficient. Human beings, he claimed, are not enlightened by reason alone, but guided by compassion and collective feeling. Rousseau's religious philosophy is closely linked to his moral vision. He posits that the essence of goodness lies not in obedience, but in authenticity, in acting according to one's deepest convictions. He laments the prevalence of civilized morality, which is based on utility and self-interest, advocating instead for a return to simple virtues of honesty, empathy, and mutual aid. This natural heart is cultivated through education, experience, and reflection in solitude. The implications for society are revolutionary. Rousseau champions civic religion, outlined in the social contract, which binds citizens through shared ceremonies and symbols rather than dogmatic doctrine. He believes that society must foster awe, gratitude, and moral purpose, building communal order without coercion. Yet he warns against the seductions of fanaticism and intolerance, seeking a delicate balance between private piety and public ethics. Rousseau's religious and moral outlook reverberates throughout his life and writings. Persecuted and misunderstood, he found solace in nature and reflection, insisting that spiritual truth is accessible in every landscape and every heart. This faith, deeply personal yet radically communal, informs his vision of education, politics, and personal redemption. Despite criticisms, charges of sentimentalism, naivete, and inconsistency, Rousseau's vision remains compelling. He calls upon each person to seek sincerity over conformity, love over calculation, and courage over complacency. In a world fractured by ideological conflict, Rousseau's natural heart offers a template for compassion, dignity, and hope. Chapter 12. The War with the Enlightenment. Breaking with Voltaire and Diderot. Rousseau's intellectual journey is marked by an extraordinary rupture with the very movement that fostered his early development. The Enlightenment. In the Parisian salons of the 1750s and 1760s, Rousseau was both collaborator and antagonist to figures such as Voltaire and Diderot, engaging in a war of ideas that would reverberate across Europe. Initially, Rousseau's association with the encyclopedists, the architects of Enlightenment rationalism, was cordial and productive. He contributed articles to Diderot's Encyclopédie and participated in literary circles advocating reform and critical inquiry. However, Rousseau soon grew disillusioned with the presumptions of reason, progress, and cosmopolitanism championed by his peers. The rift became manifest with publications such as Discourse on the Sciences and Arts, 1750, in which Rousseau launched a polemic against the prevailing optimism of Enlightenment thought. He argued that scientific and artistic progress do not necessarily liberate humanity, but instead foster moral decay, vanity, and inequality. The pursuit of intellectual achievement, Rousseau insisted, can enlarge the gap between rich and poor and erode the foundations of virtue and simplicity. Voltaire, the consummate rationalist and wit, responded with caustic mockery. The dispute escalated further when Rousseau's Emile and social contract challenged the authority of conventional wisdom. Voltaire ridiculed Rousseau's sentimentalism and alleged primitivism, while Rousseau accused Voltaire of cynicism, elitism, and a lack of empathy for the poor. Diderot, Rousseau's erstwhile confidant, became embroiled in the quarrel, their friendship dissolving amid accusations of betrayal and misunderstanding. At the heart of these conflicts lay divergent understandings of human nature, society, and progress. Rousseau doubted that reason alone could remedy the evils of society. He saw emotion, compassion, and the nurturing of civic virtue as indispensable. The quarrels with Voltaire and Diderot were partly personal, partly philosophical, an early illustration of the tensions between head and heart, skepticism and sentiment, individual and community. The consequences were profound. Rousseau's isolation deepened as he lost allies and attracted vitriolic criticism. His works, banned and censored, became symbols of dissent. Yet Rousseau's willingness to break with the luminaries of his age infused his writings with urgency and authenticity. He saw himself not as a destroyer of the Enlightenment, but as its conscience and corrective, urging the search for truth beyond the limits of reason. The war with the Enlightenment is emblematic of the perennial struggle within modernity, the quest to balance the demands of rational inquiry with the needs of feeling, tradition, and the social bond. Rousseau's critique, controversial at its inception, presaged later movements of Romanticism, existentialism, and even contemporary communitarianism. His engagement with Voltaire and Diderot remains a searching dialogue on the foundations and futures of Western thought. In reassessing these disputes, we see not merely the drama of intellectual rivalry, but the evolution of a philosophy grounded in deeply ethical concerns. Rousseau's break with the Enlightenment underscores his radical independence and the profound influence of solitude, reflection, and emotional authenticity in his work. His legacy challenges us still to ponder whether progress entails not just the development of knowledge, but the cultivation of wisdom and virtue. Chapter 13. The War with the Enlightenment, breaking with Voltaire and Diderot. The Enlightenment, an epoch marked by intellectual ferment and bold aspirations for societal reform, saw the rise of towering personalities, philosophers, writers, and scientists committed to reason, progress, and knowledge. Amid this constellation, Jean-Jacques Rousseau emerged as a paradoxical luminary, initially embraced by the eminent figures of his day, yet ultimately becoming their most trenchant critic. Rousseau's early years in Paris were characterized by fervent involvement with the philosophes, particularly Denis Diderot and Voltaire. Both men, renowned for their wit and intellect, recognized in Rousseau an original and potent mind. Diderot and Rousseau first met in 1742, and their friendship flourished on the shared ideals of reforming society and championing intellectual liberty. Rousseau's contributions to the Encyclopédie and his passionate discourse on music, education, and political theory earned him a place at the heart of the Enlightenment project. Yet this harmony would not endure. The ideological schism that grew between Rousseau and his peers was as much personal as philosophical. In 1750, Rousseau published his celebrated Discourse on the Sciences and Arts, a treatise that boldly asserted that civilization and progress had corrupted human virtue and morality. Where Voltaire and Diderot heralded knowledge and reason as the engines of human betterment, Rousseau posited an unsettling thesis that enlightenment, far from delivering liberation, had bound man in new chains. This rupture widened as Rousseau authored the Discourse on the Origin and Foundations of Inequality Among Men in 1755. Here, he advanced his vision of natural man unspoiled by society and asserted that the social institutions lauded by his contemporaries were, in fact, sources of subjugation and vice. Rousseau's insistence on the inherent goodness of humanity in its primitive state, juxtaposed with his critique of progress, cast him as a heretic among the philosophes. Voltaire responded with biting sarcasm, lampooning Rousseau's notion of the noble savage and questioning his sincerity. Diderot, wounded by Rousseau's increasingly erratic behavior and accusations of betrayal, began to distance himself. Philosophically, this schism revolved around the foundational values of the Enlightenment. Voltaire's unwavering defense of reason, science, and individual rights clashed diametrically with Rousseau's suspicion of reason and his prioritization of sentiment, emotion, and natural simplicity. Rousseau dared to articulate what many contemporaries perceived as retrograde ideas, that civilization's refinements were a mask for deep-seated alienation and misery, that the cultivation of the arts and sciences, rather than engendering virtue, had fostered vanity and duplicity. The rupture was also deeply personal. Rousseau's escalating paranoia led him to suspect his former friends of conspiracies and slanders. Diderot, once a confidant, became, through a series of misunderstandings and recriminations, a rival beset by jealousy and distrust. Voltaire's acerbic pen issued rejoinders that stung Rousseau deeply, amplifying the sense of isolation that would later define his exile years. It is within this context that Rousseau's philosophical originality is most keenly illuminated. By breaking with the Enlightenment's dominant narratives, Rousseau opened new pathways for contemplating the relationship between the individual, society, and nature. His intellectual rebellion was not born of caprice, but of a profound conviction that the prevailing trajectory of human progress was fundamentally flawed, an affront to the dignity and wholeness of the person. In challenging the era's grand consensus, Rousseau paved the way for new visions of politics, education, and selfhood. His rupture with Voltaire and Diderot signaled a seismic shift from the primacy of the rational intellect to an exploration of the heart, from the celebration of civilization to a longing for the innocence of nature. Through this war with the Enlightenment, Rousseau not only defined himself in opposition to contemporaries, but forged an intellectual legacy that would reverberate through centuries. The chapters that follow will trace the consequences of this break, unveiling Rousseau's journey as one marked by exile, introspection, and the relentless pursuit of freedom. Chapter 14, The Exile Years, Persecution and Paranoia. The publication of Rousseau's major works did not merely engender philosophical debate. It catalyzed a storm of controversy that would shape the remainder of his life. By the late 1750s, Rousseau found himself increasingly alienated, both ideologically and socially, from the circles that once celebrated him. His rupture with Voltaire and Diderot had grown public, intensifying the scrutiny directed at his every word and action. Consequently, Rousseau embarked upon a period marked by a series of exiles, driven by both external persecution and the internal anxieties that haunted him. This era of exile began dramatically in 1762 with the publication of The Social Contract and Emile. Both works challenged the foundational tenets of society, religion and education, infuriating not only Enlightenment thinkers but also authorities both secular and ecclesiastic. The Social Contract's revolutionary assertion that legitimate government rests on the general will unsettled monarchs and legislators, while Emile's radical departure from orthodox education and its critique of organized religion provoked religious leaders. The immediate reaction was swift and severe. The Parlement of Paris condemned Emile, ordering its public burning and issuing a warrant for Rousseau's arrest. He fled first to Switzerland, seeking refuge near his birthplace of Geneva. The Swiss authorities, however, fearful of the inflammatory potential of Rousseau's ideas and mindful of diplomatic pressures, soon forced him to move on. His odyssey led him to numerous places: Moutier, the Ile de Saint-Pierre, and eventually England, each marked by growing isolation and a heightened sense of paranoia. Rousseau's experiences during this period were harrowing. In Moutier's, subjected to surveillance and hostile public opinion, he endured religious denunciation and anonymous threats. Stones shattered the windows of his modest home, and pamphlets circulated defaming his character. The trauma of perpetual suspicion amplified Rousseau's psychological fragility. Already prone to self-doubt, he became increasingly convinced that powerful forces conspired against him. The exile years coincided with a dramatic intensification of Rousseau's introspective tendencies. Deprived of supportive companionship and beset by accusations and betrayals, he turned inward, seeking solace in nature and writing. It was during his stay at the Ile de Saint-Pierre, after expulsion from Moutier, that Rousseau authored parts of the Reveries of a Solitary Walker. These meditative texts reveal a mind-seeking equilibrium amidst chaos, striving to reclaim a sense of inner peace that civilization and society steadfastly denied him. Rousseau's arrival in England in 1766, at the invitation of the Scottish philosopher David Hume, briefly promised respite. Hume's hospitality and admiration for Rousseau's genius suggested an opportunity for stability. However, the relationship soured rapidly. Rousseau grew suspicious of Hume's motives, interpreting friendly overtures as covert manipulations. His correspondence became increasingly erratic, marked by accusations and unresolved grievances, a testament to the deep paranoia that beset his mental state. Despite the myriad hardships endured during these years, Rousseau's exile proved intellectually fecund. Alienation and adversity catalyzed some of his most profound reflections on society, human nature, and the limits of reason. It was under these conditions that the seeds for Confessions and Reveries of a Solitary Walker were sown. Rousseau, confronting the abyss of solitude, forged a new literary and philosophical vocabulary for articulating the struggles of the marginalized and misunderstood. The exile years were thus a crucible, forging Rousseau from controversial thinker into solitary visionary. Haunted by persecution and internalized paranoia, he transcended the limitations imposed by circumstance. Seeking refuge in nature, he developed an acute sensitivity to the drama of existence, a sensitivity that would deeply inform his subsequent works. Rousseau's journey through exile reveals not only the precariousness of intellectual descent, but also the indomitable resilience of an individual determined to remain faithful to his convictions in the face of relentless opposition. Chapter 15. The Confessions, the birth of modern autobiography. The trajectory of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's intellectual and existential journey reaches a profound inflection with Confessions, an extraordinary work that inaugurates the modern tradition of autobiography. Composed during the turbulent final decades of his life, Confessions transcends mere recollection. It is a monument of introspection, candor, and literary innovation, a testament to Rousseau's quest for authenticity amidst a world that had turned hostile. Written between 1765 and 1770, Confessions is structured in 12 books, spanning Rousseau's early childhood in Geneva, the Parisian salons of his formative years, and the subsequent decades of controversy and exile. Unlike the self-congratulatory memoirs characteristic of the period, Rousseau's narrative is animated by an unflinching commitment to truth, even when that truth exposes his faults, follies, and contradictions. From the very outset, Rousseau situates himself in radical opposition to the conventions of autobiography. His opening declaration, "I am commencing a work that has no example," serves as both a challenge and an invitation. Where previous autobiographies masked the self through artifice and idealization, Rousseau endeavors to strip away all pretense, to reveal, in his words, the man as he really is. This commitment to transparency is revolutionary, setting a precedent for subsequent generations of writers who would grapple with the enigma of selfhood. Rousseau's narrative style is vivid and confessional, marked by psychological acuity and an acute sense of drama. He recounts the formative experiences that shaped his character, the loss of his mother in infancy, the fraught relationship with his father, and the constellation of influences encountered during his peripatetic youth. He spares neither himself nor the reader from uncomfortable truths, narrating thefts, cruelties, and betrayals, each confession a meditation on the complexity of human nature. The literary significance of Confessions resides not only in its psychological depth, but in its philosophical implications. Rousseau's insistence on individual perspective as the locus of truth reconfigures the relationship between author and audience. He challenges the reader to suspend judgment, to bear witness to his vulnerabilities and aspirations. This rhetorical strategy democratizes the act of storytelling. Rousseau asserts the legitimacy of every lived experience, including those marked by error and transgression. Confessions also serves as a repository for Rousseau's ongoing meditation on alienation and belonging. He details the circumstances that led to his rupture with Voltaire and Diderot, the torment of exile, and the unyielding suspicion that colored his later years. The narrative is infused with a haunting sense of isolation, yet it is within this solitude that Rousseau discovers the transformative power of introspection. His suffering becomes the crucible for self-understanding, a means of reclaiming agency in a world intent on silencing dissent as a literary artifact. Confessions exerts an unparalleled influence upon subsequent generations. Rousseau's candid scrutiny of self inspires the likes of Goethe, Wordsworth, and Tolstoy, and shapes the contours of romantic literature and modern autobiography. The text is not merely personal, it is prophetic, articulating the foundational dilemmas of individual identity and collective belonging that resonate acutely in modernity. Ultimately, Confessions stands as Rousseau's witness to his own life, an act of courage and vulnerability in which he claims the right to tell his story, regardless of public opinion or social cost. In revealing the intimate theater of his existence, Rousseau invites his readers to confront their own complexities, reminding us that the search for authenticity, however fraught, is an essential measure of human dignity. Chapter 16. Education Reimagined, The Lessons of Émile. Among Rousseau's most enduring contributions is his treatise on education. Émile, or On Education, published in 1762. This monumental work performs a radical reconfiguration of educational principles, challenging both the authoritarian strategies of 18th century pedagogy and the abstract rationalism of his Enlightenment contemporaries. Rousseau begins Emile by lamenting the distortions of civilized education, which he argues suppresses genuine feeling and stifles individuality. Conventional schools, he claims, produce conformity, artificiality, and dependence. Rousseau proposes instead an education rooted in nature, designed to liberate rather than constrain. His method is guided not by rote learning or moralistic doctrine, but by respect for the developmental stages of childhood. Emile, the fictional protagonist, is raised away from the corrupting influences of society, under the careful guidance of a tutor who adapts lessons to his natural curiosity. Rousseau's model syncs with his famous assertion, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." Education, then, is the art of keeping these chains at bay, of cultivating the innate goodness Rousseau believes all children possess. In Rousseau's schema, infancy is a time of sensation and developing trust. The child must be protected from both physical and emotional harm, and learning should center on exploration, not discipline. As Emile matures, his education follows his capacities. Physical exercise, practical skills, and exposure to nature form the core. Book learning is postponed until the child is ready to question, seek, and understand. Rousseau famously warns against teaching morality too early, arguing that lessons about virtue must spring from lived experience rather than prescription. This approach, revolutionary for its time, makes Rousseau the ancestor of progressive education. He advocates for holistic pedagogy, in which intellectual development is inseparable from emotional well-being and social responsibility. The tutor's role shifts from authoritarian instructor to benevolent guide. Rousseau's nuanced stages, childhood, boyhood, adolescence, are tailored to the evolving needs of the learner. Rousseau's Emile challenges gender norms as well, though not always in a progressive fashion. The introduction of Sophie, Emile's intended companion, highlights Rousseau's conviction that women require a different kind of education, one oriented toward domesticity and supporting male virtue. While this position has drawn criticism from feminist scholars, it reflects Rousseau's larger belief in education's organic adaptation to natural roles. The lessons of Emile extend beyond pedagogy. Rousseau, long before psychologists like Piaget and Montessori, emphasizes that learning cannot be forced. The intellect, like a plant, must grow in its own season. Socialization and civic responsibility are acquired only through dialogue, empathy, and experience. He claims children should learn the consequences of their actions and cultivate self-restraint through engagement, not fear. The ultimate aim is a citizen capable of self-governance, empathy, and reason, not merely compliance. Rousseau's model has limitations, especially its reliance on isolation from a corrupt society and its sentimental idealization of natural man. Still, his ideas transformed modern education, inspiring thinkers such as Pestalozzi, Froebel, and Dewey. The challenge he posed remains urgent: to educate not merely for knowledge or obedience, but for freedom and virtue. Emile is not a prescription, but an invitation to reimagine education as the art of cultivation, to honor the unique potential of every child, and to interrogate how schools preserve or imperil this potential. Rousseau's voice, alternately poetic and polemical, continues to resonate wherever education is considered a fundamental ground of liberty. Chapter 17, The Reveries of a Solitary Walker, Peace in Nature. As the pressures of exile and public hostility mounted, Jean-Jacques Rousseau retreated ever more deeply into solitude, finding in nature a sanctuary for reflection and repose. It is within this existential context that he composed Reveries of a Solitary Walker, Les Rêveries du Promeneur Solitaire, a work that embodies his search for peace amid adversity, and his enduring meditation on the relationship between humanity and the natural world. written in the final years of Rousseau's life. Reveries unfolds as a series of 10 meditative essays or walks. Rousseau, cast adrift from society, embraces wandering as both a literal and philosophical act, a journey towards self-discovery through communion with the landscape. The natural world becomes both companion and confidant, offering solace when human company has proven treacherous. The reveries articulate a profound sense of inner tranquility, achieved through immersion in nature. Rousseau writes, "I feel more like myself when I am alone. I never have such thoughts as when I walk in the woods. This solitude is not mere withdrawal, but an active engagement with the beauty and rhythms of the natural environment. Fields, rivers and meadows become sites of philosophical inquiry. Through observation and contemplation, Rousseau experiences moments of epiphany, clarity, and serenity impossible to attain in the tumult of society. Central to reveries is the conviction that nature fosters authenticity and spiritual well-being. Rousseau identifies the alienation of civilization as rooted in artifice and competition. In contrast, the simplicity of nature offers restoration. He describes encounters with birds, flowers, and trees as revelations, each instance affirming his belief in the inherent goodness and harmony of the natural order. The walks thus serve as ritual acts of renewal, through which Rousseau aspires to realign his soul with the elemental forces that shape existence. Yet reveries are not merely idyllic escapism. Rousseau acknowledges the sorrows and vulnerabilities that persist even in solitude. He confronts memories of betrayal, the pain of exclusion, and the specter of impending death. Nature, while offering refuge, cannot wholly erase the wounds inflicted by human cruelty. Rousseau's meditations are thus richly ambivalent, oscillating between gratitude for moments of peace and acknowledgement of enduring suffering. Philosophically, Reveries inaugurates a new sensitivity toward the environment, an ethos that would profoundly inform the Romantic movement. Rousseau's celebration of nature as a source of wisdom and spiritual nourishment prefigures later developments in literature, ecology, and psychology. His writing affirms the value of attentiveness and wonder, proposing that the contemplative mind is uniquely capable of grasping the interdependence between oneself and the world. The structure of reveries, episodic, personal and non-linear, reflects Rousseau's conviction that truth is discovered not through abstract reason, but through lived experience. Each walk is a fragment of autobiography, weaving together memory, observation, and philosophical reflection. The narrative is imbued with poetic resonance, inviting the reader to partake in Rousseau's vision of harmony and renewal. Above all, Reveries of a Solitary Walker stands as Rousseau's testament to the restorative power of nature. Isolated but unbroken, he discovers in the landscape the possibility of healing, clarity, and consolation. Through his wanderings, Rousseau reclaims the dignity and inner freedom that civilization had denied him, affirming the hope that, in returning to nature, one might rediscover the essential sources of peace and contentment. In doing so, he bequeaths to posterity a lyrical wisdom that continues to inspire and challenge. Chapter 18. Rousseau's paradox between freedom and constraint. At the core of Rousseau's philosophical oeuvre lies a persistent, some would say, agonizing paradox. The tension between the aspiration for freedom and the reality of constraint. This paradox is neither superficial nor accidental. It constitutes the defining challenge of Rousseau's life and thought, shaping his approach to questions of politics, morality, and education. Rousseau's conception of freedom is radical. In his foundational text, The Social Contract, he famously asserts, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." This proclamation encapsulates both the natural condition of liberty and the multifarious social mechanisms by which freedom is curtailed. For Rousseau, the passage from nature into society is fraught. The formation of political institutions, laws, and conventions inevitably introduces hierarchy, inequality, and dependency. Yet Rousseau is no simple primitivist. He does not advocate a literal return to the savage state, nor does he deny the necessity of social organization. Rather, he seeks to mediate the relationship between individuality and collective life, a synthesis in which liberty and social belonging are harmonized. Key to this vision is the concept of the general will, the idea that genuine freedom emerges not through isolated autonomy, but through participation in a political community governed by shared purpose. This mediation, however, is fraught with difficulty. Rousseau's critique of civilization is unwavering. He acknowledges that the institutions designed to protect and cultivate human flourishing routinely devolve into mechanisms of domination and alienation. The paradox unfolds. Society, which promises to enhance freedom, risks instituting new forms of constraint and dependency. Rousseau's experiments with educational reform in Emile echo the same dilemma. He dreams of nurturing the natural goodness of the child, yet is constantly aware of the distorting effects of socializing influences, from prejudices to hierarchies to ill-conceived pedagogies. The paradox deepens in Rousseau's personal ethos. His life, marked by rebellion against authority, is equally characterized by periods of submission and vulnerability. He seeks autonomy, yet is subject to the frailties and limits of circumstance. His relentless quest for solitude, as revealed in Reveries, simultaneously reflects a desire for self-sufficiency and a poignant awareness of dependency upon nature, upon fleeting moments of human kindness, upon the possibility of being understood. Philosophically, Rousseau's paradox raises foundational questions. Is freedom a state to be reclaimed through isolation or through collective engagement? Can constraint be abolished, or is it an inescapable condition of existence? Rousseau's answer is provisional. Freedom and constraint are not absolute states, but dynamic processes perpetually negotiated in the unfolding drama of life. The chains are real, yet the longing for liberation endures, a testament to the irrepressible vitality of the human spirit. This tension reverberates through Rousseau's influence on subsequent thinkers. Revolutionary movements drew inspiration from his calls for liberty and equality, even as they grappled with the unavoidable complexity of governance and law. The Romantic tradition found in Rousseau's paradox a philosophical vocabulary for describing the struggle between authenticity and conformity, spontaneity and discipline. In the final analysis, Rousseau's paradox between freedom and constraint is not a dilemma to be resolved, but a condition to be inhabited. It invites us to recognize the limits of our autonomy, to reflect upon the sources of our belonging and alienation, and to pursue, however fitfully, the reconciliation of our most profound aspirations with the realities of the world. Rousseau's legacy is, in this sense, profoundly modern, forever challenging us to affirm the possibility of freedom, even amid the constraints that define our existence. Chapter 19, The Influence of Rousseau, Revolution, Romanticism, and Modern Politics. From the tumultuous beginnings of his intellectual career, Jean-Jacques Rousseau emerged as one of the most influential figures of the 18th century. His ideas reverberated across Europe, fueling movements that would radically reshape society and unleash new forms of political and artistic expression. In this chapter, we explore the dimensions of Rousseau's influence, mapping its contours through the interconnected pathways of revolution, Romanticism, and modern politics. Rousseau's political philosophy, crystallized in his seminal work Du Contrat Social, The Social Contract, presented a vision of society grounded in freedom, equality, and the general will. Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains, he famously declared, encapsulating both the tragedy and the potential of human existence within civil structures. At the core of Rousseau's argument lies the critique of illegitimate authority, whether derived from historical accident or entrenched privilege. Instead, Rousseau advocated for a new form of social organization, when rooted in the collective agreement and participation of its members. The revolutionary implications of Rousseau's thought became manifest during the late 18th century, culminating in the ideological fervor of the French Revolution. Leaders such as Robespierre and Saint-Just invoked the principles outlined in the social contract to justify radical transformations of state and society, seeking to construct a republic grounded in virtue and the public good. Rousseau's conception of popular sovereignty and his insistence on the moral reformation of society inspired not only the architects of the revolution, but also subsequent movements for democratic reform. Beyond the political arena, Rousseau's influence extended into the artistic and emotional domains, heralding the emergence of Romanticism. Rousseau's autobiographical works, notably Les Confessions and Rêveries du promeneur solitaire, broke with classical conventions, prioritizing personal experience, introspection, and the expression of individual sentiment. His celebration of the emotional life and the authenticity of one's inner voice resonated with poets, writers, and painters seeking to reclaim the realm of feeling from the strictures of reason. Figures such as Goethe, Wordsworth, and Chateaubriand would draw inspiration from Rousseau's meditations on nature and the self, constructing artistic traditions that valued spontaneity, originality, and emotional depth. The Romantic movement, with Rousseau as its spiritual forebear, contributed to a seismic shift in cultural consciousness. The individual's relationship to nature became not merely a philosophical inquiry, but a source of artistic creativity and existential meaning. Rousseau's vision facilitated a reimagining of humanity's place in the cosmos, encouraging a turn towards the sublime, the mysterious, and the unmediated experience of the natural world. In the evolving landscape of modern politics, Rousseau's ideas remain a touchstone for debates about democracy, representation, and citizenship. His insistence on the general will as the foundation of political legitimacy continues to inform discussions about popular sovereignty and participatory governance. Moreover, his skepticism towards the concentration of power and the alienation inherent in unequal societies resonates in contemporary critiques of bureaucracy, technocracy, and the erosion of communal bonds. Yet Rousseau's legacy is not without controversy. His emphasis on the unity of the general will has been interpreted at times as a justification for authoritarian tendencies. Critics have argued that the abstraction of collective intention can obscure individual differences and suppress dissent. Others have highlighted the tensions in Rousseau's thought between autonomy and conformity, between the freedom of the individual and the obligations of the community. Even so, Rousseau's enduring impact lies in his capacity to provoke reflection and challenge complacency. His model of transformative action, whether in confronting injustice or pursuing personal authenticity, offers a blueprint for both revolutionaries and reformers, artists and philosophers. The interplay between reason and emotion, authority and liberty, history and nature, these are the themes that define Rousseau's influence and give shape to the ongoing struggles for meaning and justice. In summary, Rousseau's legacy weaves a complex tapestry spanning the domains of revolution, romanticism, and modern political thought. His intellectual contributions continue to inspire, unsettle, and illuminate, bearing witness to the power of ideas to shape the destinies of individuals and societies. In the chapters that follow, we deepen our understanding of Rousseau's influence and unpack the nuanced dimensions of his thought, tracing a path through nature and civilization, freedom and constraint. Chapter 20, The Eternal Return to Nature, Rousseau's Legacy Today. In the modern era, Rousseau's legacy endures with renewed vigor, especially in the discourse surrounding nature and civilization. The eternal return to nature, a motif central to Rousseau's writings, finds resonance in contemporary societal, environmental, and philosophical challenges. In this chapter, we investigate Rousseau's relevance today, examining the ways in which his vision continues to shape and interrogate the trajectories of human development. Rousseau's insistence on the restorative power of nature was more than a literary trope. It constituted a systematic critique of the alienation induced by modern society. For Rousseau, the natural conditions symbolized not merely innocence, but also authenticity, a state in which individuals could reclaim their genuine selves. Liberated from the constraints of social convention, this perspective undergirds contemporary movements ranging from ecological activism to existential philosophy, each seeking reconciliation between the human spirit and the environment. Global environmental crises have returned Rousseau's insights to the forefront. The ongoing degradation of ecosystems, the loss of biodiversity, and the proliferation of industrial pollutants pose fundamental questions about the relationship between humanity and nature. In response, activists and theorists invoke Rousseau's arguments about the necessity of balance, respect for the environment, and the ethical imperative to curtail artificial excess. Rousseau's celebration of the natural world animates the advocacy for green spaces, sustainable development, and ecological education, lending philosophical depth to practical initiatives aimed at safeguarding the planet. However, the return to nature is not without its ambiguities. Rousseau himself recognized that one could not simply regress to a pre-civilized state. Rather, he sought a transformation of consciousness, a reorientation towards simplicity, virtue, and empathy. Modern proponents of environmentalism and back-to-nature movements must grapple with these complexities, acknowledging the limitations of nostalgia while pursuing innovative solutions to contemporary problems. The Rousseauian legacy urges a critical engagement with both the material and spiritual dimensions of the human experience, one that embraces harmony without abandoning progress. On a cultural level, Rousseau's legacy endures in the realms of literature, art, and psychology. The depiction of nature as a site of healing and self-discovery, central to Rousseau's autobiographical texts, has influenced genres from romantic poetry to modern memoir. The solitary walks, the reveries beneath ancient trees, and the contemplation of mountain vistas evoke the timeless search for meaning beyond the confines of industrial society. Modern psychology, especially in its emphasis on authentic living and emotional well-being, draws upon Rousseau's insights into the dissonance between inner desire and external demand. Technological advancements further complicate the Rousseauian narrative, introducing new forms of alienation, but also novel opportunities for connection and creativity. In the digital age, the quest for authenticity confronts the mediated world of virtual interaction and constructed identities. Rousseau's call to return to nature thus gains renewed urgency, inviting reflection on the boundaries of selfhood and the possibilities for genuine communication. Political theorists continue to draw on Rousseau's principles in the formulation of contemporary policies. Issues of social justice, community participation, and public deliberation are informed by Rousseau's critique of inequality and his advocacy for inclusive citizenship. Whether in debates about urban planning, environmental regulation, or educational reform, the Rousseauian ideal of a society attuned to nature and responsive to human needs remains a guiding light. Fundamentally, the eternal return to nature is not a mere retreat, but a forward movement, a dialectic between critique and creation, memory and innovation. Rousseau's legacy invites each generation to reconsider the foundations of their society and to seek pathways towards harmony, integrity, and justice. The challenge lies not in replicating the past, but in embodying its spirit, transforming the insights of nature into the practice of civilization. Thus, Rousseau's relevance today is manifest in the enduring quest for equilibrium between the individual and the community, the natural and the artificial, the past and the future. His legacy continues to inspire reflection and action, reminding us that the path to authenticity and wisdom is always open to those who would venture between nature and civilization. If you found this video helpful, inspiring, or entertaining, don't forget to hit that like button. And if you're new here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss out on future content. Your support means the world. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.